Rowan Cross had always considered himself a light sleeper, a necessary adaptation after 2 years managing the administrative chaos of Nithro's station, where emergencies had a habit of announcing themselves at 3 in the morning through shrieking comm systems. So when he drifted up from sleep with the fuzzy awareness that something wasn't quite right, his first coherent thought was that the environmental processors had failed again, and he'd wake up covered in condensation like last month's incident. His second thought, arriving with significantly more urgency, was that his bed felt occupied. Not the usual occupied feeling of having rolled into a bunched-up thermal blanket or positioned a pillow poorly. This was the specific, undeniable sensation of another person's weight depressing the mattress beside him, close enough that he could feel residual body heat radiating through the standard-issue sheets. Rowan's eyes snapped open in the dim amber lighting that passed for nighttime on a station orbiting a dying red giant, and he found himself staring directly into the face of a woman he had absolutely never seen before in his life. She was watching him, not sleeping, not drowsy, not even pretending to be unconscious. Just watching with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for predators evaluating prey or scientists observing particularly interesting bacterial cultures. Her face was perhaps 6 inches from his, pale enough that the low light seemed to make her skin luminescent, and framed by black hair that spilled across his pillow like an ink stain. The angular features would have been striking under any circumstances, but it was the ears that made Rowan's already racing heart kick into territory usually reserved for hull breach alarms. Long, elegantly pointed, absolutely not human. For approximately 3 seconds, Rowan's brain stuttered through several potential responses. Scream. Activate the emergency beacon built into his bedside console. Roll off the bed and sprint for the door. Possibly die of shock right there and save everyone the trouble. What emerged from his mouth was a strangled sound somewhere between a yelp and a wheeze. The woman, to her credit, didn't move. She simply continued watching him with eyes that reflected the amber light in a way human eyes definitely shouldn't. And when she spoke, her voice was low and accented with something Rowan couldn't identify, carrying the tone of someone apologizing for a minor social inconvenience rather than explaining their presence in a stranger's bed. Please don't activate your emergency beacon. This is awkward enough without station security. Rowan realized his hand had indeed been reaching for the console panel. He froze mid-motion, which seemed appropriate since every other system in his body had apparently decided to shut down for maintenance. His voice, when he finally located it, came out significantly higher than usual. How are you in my bed? The door, she said with perfect seriousness. I came through the door, though I had to override your lock, which I apologize for. It seemed rude but necessary. Necessary, Rowan repeated, because apparently his brain had decided that echoing words was the best it could manage under the circumstances. He was still lying on his side, frozen in place, wearing nothing but his sleep shirt and shorts, and becoming increasingly aware that this woman was fully clothed in dark, practical traveling gear that looked distinctly weathered. She was on top of his covers, he noted with the kind of hysterical attention to detail that trauma sometimes produced. At least there was that barrier between them, thin as it was. I needed shelter before sunrise, she continued, as if this explanation was perfectly reasonable. Your quarters were the closest viable option, and more importantly, you were alone. The scent signature from your ventilation output indicated a single human occupant with no recent visitors. That made you ideal. Ideal for what exactly? Rowan managed, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted the answer. His eyes had adjusted enough now to take in more details. The worn leather of her jacket, the careful way she'd positioned herself on the very edge of the mattress, as if trying to minimize the intrusion, the fact that despite her casual tone, there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested exhaustion. She seemed to consider how to phrase her response, then apparently decided directness was simplest. I'm a vampire. The station's day cycle is about to begin, and I needed somewhere dark and secure to spend it. Your quarters fit both requirements, and your human scent would mask my presence from anyone tracking me. I promise I mean you no harm. I simply need to stay until nightfall, and then I'll disappear from your life completely. You'll never see me again." Rowan blinked several times. His brain was attempting to process multiple impossibilities simultaneously and failing at each one. "Vampire," he said slowly. "You're telling me you're a vampire?" "Yes." "Like the old Earth legends, blood-drinking, sunlight-averse, undead creatures of the night. The photosensitivity is quite real, as are the dietary restrictions, though undead is biologically inaccurate and frankly offensive," she replied with a slight edge of irritation. "We're evolved divergents, not supernatural entities. But yes, those legends were based on my people." "Right," Rowan heard himself say. "Sure, that makes perfect sense. There's a vampire in my bed because vampires are real and you needed to avoid sunlight. On a space station, orbiting a red giant, where the sunlight is literally artificial and controlled by timer algorithms that I personally helped optimize last quarter. The photon spectrum is close enough to natural starlight that the effect is the same," she said. "And I did mention people are tracking me, which is why I couldn't simply rent my own quarters or seek official asylum. This arrangement was meant to be convenient for both of us. You wouldn't even know I was here, except I miscalculated how much time I had before you'd wake. I apologize for the shock." "The shock," Rowan repeated again, then let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been quite so unhinged. "I'm sorry, but this is. I wake up, and there's an alien vampire woman in my bed, apologizing for startling me like she showed up early for a scheduled appointment. Do you understand how absolutely insane this is?" Something that might have been amusement flickered across her face. "I did at least lock the door behind me after breaking in. I'm not a barbarian." Despite everything, the fear, the confusion, the creeping certainty that he'd somehow fallen asleep and was experiencing the universe's most specific anxiety dream, Rowan felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere in his chest. It emerged as a slightly manic giggle that he immediately regretted. But the absurdity of her wounded dignity about door security when she'd literally invaded his bed was too much. The woman's expression shifted to something that might have been approval, and she relaxed fractionally. "You're handling this better than the last person I explained my situation to," she offered. "He activated a full station alarm and I had to knock him unconscious to avoid capture. You're just lying there processing. It's refreshing." "Oh good," Rowan said weakly. "I'm refreshingly non-hysterical, that's something." He took a breath, trying to force his thoughts into some kind of organized pattern. "Okay, let's say I believe you about being a vampire, which I'm not sure I do, but we'll table that for now. You said people are tracking you. The Intersystem Covenant employs professional hunters to neutralize what they classify as biological hazards. My people fall into that category." She said it without drama, but Rowan caught the bitter edge underneath. "They've been systematically purging vampire populations across the outer colonies for the past decade. I've been running for 3 months. They caught my trail at the last station, and I barely made it to a transport before they locked down the docks." "And you came to Nithros," Rowan said, trying to ignore how his heart was still hammering. "To the most isolated research and agricultural outpost in this sector, where nothing interesting ever happens, and we're so understaffed that I had to mediate a dispute between 2 xenobiologists over lab equipment yesterday, because we don't have enough supervisors." "Exactly. Remote stations have smaller security details, fewer surveillance systems, more places to hide. I've stayed alive this long by going where they don't expect me to go." She shifted slightly, and Rowan tensed, but she was just adjusting her position to something that looked marginally less uncomfortable. "I tracked your scent through the residential ventilation network, confirmed you lived alone, verified your sleep cycle through thermal imaging, and overrode your lock using a security bypass I acquired 3 stations ago. The whole process took less than 4 minutes. I would have been gone before you woke up if I'd arrived even 20 minutes earlier, but I was delayed by a security patrol near the docking bay. So your plan was to just sleep in my bed while I was in it, and I'd never know. You're a remarkably still sleeper. I thought it would work. Rowan stared at her, at this impossible woman with her pointed ears and too pale skin, and casual admission of breaking and entering, and felt reality tilting sideways. Outside his small viewport, he could see the first hints of the station's artificial dawn beginning, the light panels in the corridor slowly brightening to simulate planetary rotation. Whatever else she clearly believed the sunlight, artificial or not, posed a real threat. "What's your name?" he asked finally, because it seemed like information he should have if he was going to continue this completely unhinged conversation. She hesitated, as if names were dangerous to share, then apparently decided he'd earned that much. "Celevra." "Rowan," he replied automatically. "Rowan Cross, Colony Administrator Level 3, specializing in agricultural yield optimization and resource allocation, which is possibly the least useful skill set for this situation." "I don't know," Celevra said, and he could have sworn that was almost a smile. "You haven't tried to kill me yet. That shows excellent resource management. Why waste energy on a fight you're not sure you can win?" I'm not calculating," Rowan started, then stopped because he absolutely had been making those exact calculations, however unconsciously. She was faster than him, almost certainly stronger, and he had no weapons within reach. His best option had been to stay calm and gather information, which apparently made him look like he was handling this well instead of being paralyzed by terror. "Okay, fine. So what happens now? You stay here all day while I go to work and pretend my life is normal, and tonight you leave." "That was the plan," Celevra confirmed. "The hunters will likely focus their search on the commercial and industrial sectors first, places where someone might seek supplies or try to book transport off-station. They won't expect me to be hiding in a random administrator's quarters. By nightfall, their search pattern will have moved on enough that I can slip away." Rowan's practical side, which had been thoroughly suppressed by panic until now, started functioning again. "And you can survive a day without whatever it is you need." "I fed before leaving the last station," she said carefully. "I'm not going to attack you if that's what you're worried about. I told you, I mean you no harm. You're providing sanctuary, however unknowing. That deserves respect." The amber light was definitely brighter now, the station's dawn cycle progressing. Celevra's eyes flicked toward the window, and Rowan saw genuine wariness there for the first time. She was afraid, he realized. This dangerous woman who'd broken into his quarters and could probably kill him without breaking stride was fundamentally afraid of something as simple as light. "You should probably get in the bed properly," he heard himself say. "Under the covers, I mean. If the light bothers you that much, the sheets will help until I can close the viewport shutters." Celevra looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're allowing me to stay. Do I have a choice?" "There's always a choice. You could sound the alarm right now. I'd be gone before security arrived, but I'd have to leave the station immediately. In daylight, it would be inconvenient." "Inconvenient," Rowan repeated, catching her earlier euphemism. He took a breath, made a decision that was probably catastrophically stupid, and rolled out of bed with as much dignity as he could manage while wearing wrinkled sleep clothes. "Fine, you can have the bed for today. I have a shift in 2 hours anyway, and I was going to get up soon. Just stay quiet, don't touch anything, and for the love of whatever you people believe in, be gone by the time I get back tonight." He moved to the viewport and closed the metal shutters, plunging the room into deeper darkness. When he turned back, Celevra had slipped under the covers with a speed that seemed impossible, settling into his pillow with visible relief. She watched him from the shadows, and her voice when she spoke was quieter than before. "Thank you." Rowan nodded. not trusting his voice, and fled to his tiny bathroom to try and process the fact that he just agreed to let a fugitive alien vampire sleep in his bed while he went to work. As he stood under the shower spray, he decided that this was either the beginning of a very strange story he'd tell at parties someday, or the beginning of his career's spectacular implosion. Possibly both. When he emerged, Selivra's eyes were already closed, her breathing steady and even. She looked surprisingly peaceful despite everything, almost innocent in sleep except for those distinctive ears and the predatory grace that lingered even in unconsciousness. Rowan gathered his things as quietly as possible, dressed in his standard gray administrative uniform, and paused at the door. He looked back one more time at the impossible woman in his bed, shook his head at his own idiocy, and left for what promised to be the most distracted workday of his entire life. Rowan had always prided himself on being competent under pressure. During the hydroponics flood of '83, he'd rerouted 3 weeks of water rations without losing a single crop yield percentage point. When the oxygen recyclers had hiccuped last winter, and everyone panicked about suffocating in their sleep, he'd calmly walked the engineering team through the backup protocols while breathing into a paper bag. He was, by all accounts, excellent in a crisis. Apparently that excellence did not extend to having a vampire sleeping in his bed while he pretended to care about agricultural projections. "Rowan, you still with us?" He blinked, realizing that Petra Okonkwo, the station's lead xenobiologist and the closest thing he had to a friend on this isolated rock, was waving a hand in front of his face. They were sitting in the commissary during lunch break, surrounded by the usual mix of researchers, technicians, and support staff who kept Nithros limping along on a shoestring budget and stubborn optimism. "Sorry, what?" "I asked if you'd reviewed the proposal for expanding the fungal protein vats in Section 7, Petra said, studying him with the kind of analytical interest she usually reserved for her bacterial samples. "But you've been staring at your nutrition paste like it personally offended you for the past 5 minutes. Everything okay?" "Fine," Rowan said quickly, too quickly. "Just didn't sleep well, weird dreams." "That's hey." Petra took a deliberate bite of her own meal, which looked identical to his and tasted, according to station consensus, like somebody had reverse-engineered the concept of food from a poorly written description. "Weird dreams about what exactly? Because you've got that look." "What look?" "The look people get when they're hiding something and they're really bad at it. I've seen that expression on at least 6 research assistants who were secretly dating each other against fraternization guidelines. It's very distinctive." Rowan felt heat creeping up his neck. "I'm not secretly dating anyone." "Didn't say you were, but now I'm curious what you are doing." Petra leaned forward conspiratorially, her dark eyes glinting with amusement. "Come on, Cross, give me something interesting. Do you know how boring it is studying extremophile bacteria all day? I need entertainment." "My life is exactly as boring as yours," Rowan muttered, stabbing at his nutrition paste with more force than necessary. "Nothing interesting ever happens to administrators." "Right, which is why you've checked your personal comm 3 times in the last minute and keep looking at the security feed display like it's going to sprout teeth." Rowan's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the wall-mounted display showing the station's public security feeds, cycling through various corridors and common areas. He'd been hyper-aware of it all morning, watching for any sign of unusual activity, any indication that Covenant hunters were sweeping through residential sectors, any hint that his monumentally stupid decision to harbor a fugitive was about to explode in his face. So far, nothing. Just the usual traffic of people going about their mundane business, blissfully unaware that somewhere in the residential wing, an alien vampire was napping in an administrator's bed like it was the most natural thing in the universe. "Just tired," he said again, but Petra was still watching him with that analytical expression. Before she could push further, her own comm chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at it and her eyebrows shot up. "Huh, that's interesting." What? Rowan asked, trying to sound casual and definitely failing. Security memo. Apparently they're doing random quarters inspections in the residential sectors today. Something about verifying life support integrity after that condensation incident last month. She looked up at him. You had that problem in your unit, right? The one where you woke up feeling like you'd slept in a swamp. Rowan's heart, which had been maintaining an elevated rhythm all morning, kicked into overdrive. They're doing inspections, today. Starting this afternoon, according to this. Why, you got something to hide? Petra grinned. Contraband. Unauthorized pets. A secret hydroponic weed operation. No, Rowan said, standing up so abruptly that his tray clattered against the table. Nothing. I just remembered I have a work thing, that I need to do, right now. Petra's grin faded into concern. Rowan, seriously, are you okay? You're acting really weird. I'm fine. Everything's fine. I just need to go check on some resource allocations before the afternoon briefing, he said, already backing away from the table. I'll catch up with you later. He didn't wait for her response. Just turned and headed for the commissary exit with what he hoped looked like purposeful efficiency rather than barely controlled panic. The moment he was in the corridor, he pulled out his personal comm and tried to figure out how exactly one warned a vampire about an impending security inspection without leaving a digital trail that would implicate him later. He couldn't call his own quarters. Too obvious. Couldn't send a text message. Definitely too obvious. Couldn't go back to his unit during work hours without raising questions about why an administrator suddenly needed to visit his quarters in the middle of his shift. Could he? Rowan changed direction, heading toward the residential wing while his mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios. Maybe he could claim he felt sick. Except he just told Petra he was fine, and she'd definitely notice if he suddenly developed symptoms severe enough to leave work. Maybe he could trigger a false alarm somewhere that would distract security. Except that would probably result in more security presence, not less, and potentially get him fired for criminal negligence. Maybe he could just let it happen. Let security find Selivra, wash his hands of the whole mess, claim he'd had no idea she was there. Except she'd mentioned knocking the last person unconscious to avoid capture. And Rowan had vivid mental images of his neighbors getting hurt because he'd panicked and done nothing. He was halfway to his quarters, still with no plan, when his comm buzzed with a priority message. His supervisor, Director Yang, wanted to see him immediately for an urgent matter regarding station resource allocation, which was code for "something went wrong, and I need you to fix it before I have to report it to the council." Rowan stood in the corridor, torn between two catastrophes, and made a decision that felt simultaneously rational and completely insane. He pulled up his comms interface, navigated to his quarters' environmental controls, and remotely triggered the emergency ventilation override. It would flood his unit with a harmless but pungent chemical smell that safety protocols required be investigated immediately, which would buy him maybe an hour before anyone actually entered his quarters. It was a terrible plan. It would raise questions. It would probably result in maintenance fees. But it was the best he could manage while standing in a hallway having a minor breakdown. He sent the command, took a breath, and headed toward Director Yang's office to deal with whatever administrative disaster awaited him there. Behind him, somewhere in the residential wing, alarms would be quietly alerting maintenance to a ventilation issue in Unit 347. With luck, they'd prioritize it over the scheduled inspections. With luck, Selivra would wake up, realize something was wrong, and have the sense to hide or escape or do whatever vampires did when their sanctuary was compromised. With luck, Rowan wouldn't end his career in spectacular fashion before the day was over. Director Yang's crisis turned out to involve a discrepancy in the protein synthesis, reports that somehow suggested they'd produced 300 kilograms more fungal matter than physically possible, which meant either someone had made a data entry error or they'd achieved miraculous efficiency that violated thermodynamics. Rowan spent 90 minutes tracking down the mistake, which turned out to be a decimal point in the wrong place, while simultaneously monitoring his comm for any indication that his quarters had been compromised. No alerts. No security pings. No messages from maintenance about finding an unconscious inspector and a missing vampire. Just silence, which was somehow worse than any alarm. When he finally escaped Yang's office and made his way back through the station, his shift was technically over, but the day felt like it had lasted approximately 3 weeks. The corridors were quieter now, the evening cycle beginning as the station's lighting dimmed to simulate dusk. Rowan walked toward his quarters with his stomach in knots, trying to prepare himself for whatever he might find. An empty room with signs of a struggle, security waiting to arrest him. Selivra still there, calmly reading his datapad collection like nothing had happened. Dead bodies. No bodies. All of the above simultaneously through some quantum phenomenon he was too tired to understand. What he found, when his door slid open after accepting his biometric scan, was Selivra sitting cross-legged on his bed in the dimmed lighting, wearing his spare station jumpsuit and eating one of his emergency ration bars with an expression of profound distaste. She looked up when he entered, swallowed with visible effort, and held up the ration bar accusingly. "Your food is terrible. How do humans survive on this?" Rowan closed the door behind him and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted. "You're still here?" "Obviously." She took another small bite, grimaced, and set the ration bar aside. "Though I did spend 3 hours hiding in your ventilation shaft after your quarters started smelling like a chemical spill. That was unpleasant. Was that your doing?" "There were inspections scheduled. I had to buy time." Selivra studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "You warned me. You could have let them find me," claimed ignorance. "Instead, you risked drawing attention to your quarters, specifically, to give me a chance to hide." "I panicked," Rowan said flatly. "Don't read too much into it." "Still." She stood up, and Rowan noticed she was barefoot, her boots lined up neatly beside his bed. It was such a casual, domestic detail that it made the entire situation feel even more surreal. "Thank you. Again. You're being remarkably helpful for someone who had a stranger break into their bed this morning." "It's been a very long day," Rowan said, moving past her to collapse into his desk chair. "Please tell me you're still planning to leave tonight like you promised." Selivra walked to his small viewport, now unshuttered, and looked out at the station's artificial evening. Beyond the metal structures, the red giant they orbited filled half the visible space, its dying light casting everything in shades of amber and rust. "I am. The hunters will have moved their search pattern by now. I should be able to reach the cargo docks and stow away on an outbound transport." "Good, great, excellent." Rowan rubbed his face with both hands. "Not that this hasn't been memorable, but I'd really like my life to return to being boring." "I imagine so." She turned back to face him, silhouetted against the viewport. "Though for what it's worth, you're quite good in a crisis. That ventilation override was clever thinking." "I triggered a false safety alarm, and probably violated 6 station regulations." "Still clever." She moved back toward the bed, gathering her original clothes which she'd apparently cleaned and laid out to dry. "I'll be gone within the hour. You can go back to your agricultural reports and pretend this never happened." Rowan watched her prepare to leave, and felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Maybe it was just the adrenaline crash after a day of sustained panic. Maybe it was the realization that this strange, dangerous woman had trusted him to keep her safe while she was completely vulnerable. Maybe it was the fact that he'd spent his entire shift worried about her fate and was now watching her prepare to walk back into danger. "The hunters," he heard himself say. "Are they still on the station?" Selivra paused in pulling on her jacket. "Most likely. They're thorough. But they'll be focused on outbound traffic now, expecting me to run. If I'm careful, I can avoid them." If, she agreed, meeting his eyes. "But I've been avoiding them for 3 months. I'm good at this." Rowan thought about security patterns, about the way Covenant hunters would have undoubtedly locked down cargo docks and transport bays, about how someone fleeing in darkness would stand out precisely because they were trying so hard not to be seen. He thought about finding her in his bed this morning, terrified despite her calm facade. He thought about the fact that she'd eaten his terrible rations rather than risk leaving, had hidden in his ventilation system rather than endanger him by being discovered. He thought about what happened to people the Covenant classified as biological hazards when they were caught. "Stay," he said, and the word came out before he'd fully processed making the decision. Selivra went very still. "What?" "Stay. One more day, maybe two, however long it takes for the hunters to actually leave the station." Rowan stood up, committed now to this catastrophically stupid idea. "They're watching the exits. You said it yourself. Going out there tonight is just asking to be caught. And staying here is asking you to be implicated when they eventually find me. Maybe they won't find you. Maybe they'll give up and move on to the next station. Maybe," he stopped, recognizing the desperation in his own voice. "Look, I don't know what I'm doing. I just know that letting you walk out of here tonight feels wrong, and I've already committed several violations of station policy today, so what's a few more?" Selivra studied him with those unsettling pale eyes, and Rowan couldn't read her expression at all. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Why are you doing this?" "I have no idea," Rowan admitted. "But apparently I'm the kind of person who lets fugitive vampires sleep in his bed now, so I'm just embracing it." The silence stretched between them, filled with the ambient hum of the station's life support and the distant sounds of other people living their uncomplicated lives in adjacent quarters. Then Selivra smiled, just slightly, and began taking off her jacket again. "You're either very brave or very foolish." "Definitely the second one," Rowan said, wondering what exactly he just committed himself to. "We should probably figure out sleeping arrangements. I'll take the couch tonight. You can have the bed properly this time." "That seems fair," Selivra agreed, settling back onto his mattress with visible relief. "Though your couch looks uncomfortable." "It is, but I've made a lot of bad decisions today. What's one more?" She laughed at that, a genuine sound that made her seem suddenly younger, less like a dangerous predator and more like someone who'd been running scared for too long. Rowan grabbed a spare blanket from his storage compartment and tried to arrange himself on his deeply inadequate couch, while Selivra made herself comfortable in his bed. This was insane. This was career suicide. This was going to end badly in ways he probably couldn't even imagine yet. But somehow, listening to Selivra's breathing even out as she fell asleep, Rowan felt like he'd made the right choice, even if he had no idea what he was going to do tomorrow. The couch was, without question, the most uncomfortable piece of furniture Rowan had ever encountered in his 32 years of existence. By the fourth night of sleeping on it, he developed an intimate relationship with each individual spring, learned which angles produced optimal pressure points for inducing numbness, and seriously considered filing a complaint with whatever contractor had supplied Nithro's station with what could only charitably be called seeding. "You're doing that sighing thing again," Selivra observed from the doorway to his bedroom. She'd emerged for her nightly waking routine, which apparently involved stealing his coffee ration and making pointed comments about human suffering. "I'm not sighing. You've sighed 17 times in the past hour, I counted." Rowan craned his neck to look at her, which produced an ominous cracking sound that made them both wince. "Why are you counting my sighs? Don't you have vampire things to do?" "I finished reading your entire collection of terrible adventure holonovels. The one about the space pirates who discover ancient alien technology was particularly awful. The technology was just a bigger gun. That's not even creative." She moved to his small kitchenette and began preparing coffee with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for several days. "I'm bored, which means I'm observing you. You're currently my primary source of entertainment." "Thrilled to provide a service," Rowan muttered, attempting to shift into a position that didn't make his lower back feel like it was staging a protest. And that holonovel was a gift from my ex. I kept it out of spite, not appreciation. That explains so much. Selivra handed him a cup of coffee, somehow having prepared it exactly the way he liked despite him never telling her his preferences. She just watched him make it twice and apparently memorized the process. You know, the bed is large enough for 2 people. This martyrdom is unnecessary. I'm fine on the couch. You're clearly not fine on the couch. You're developing a permanent lean to the left. That's just my natural posture, Rowan lied, accepting the coffee gratefully. They'd fallen into this pattern over the past few days, Selivra sleeping while he worked, then emerging each evening to fill his quarters with observations, complaints about his book collection, and an increasingly comfortable presence that should have felt intrusive but somehow didn't. The hunters were still on the station. Rowan had confirmed that much through careful monitoring of security channels and Petra's unwitting intelligence gathering. She'd mentioned yesterday that some Covenant officials were interviewing station personnel about unusual activity, which had sent Rowan into a brief panic spiral that Selivra had found highly amusing. You turned an interesting shade of pale, she'd said. I didn't know humans could do that. Usually you're all so aggressively pink. We're not pink, Rowan had protested. You absolutely are. It's like you're constantly blushing at your own existence. Now, sitting on his tortured device of a couch, while Selivra perched on his desk chair with her bare feet tucked under her, Rowan found himself settling into what had become their evening routine. She'd ask him about his day. He'd complain about administrative tedium, and they'd gradually drift into conversations that had stopped being about mere survival and started being about everything else. Tell me about the ex, Selivra said suddenly. The one who gave you terrible holonovels. Why? Because you've been letting a fugitive sleep in your bed for 4 days, which suggests either profound stupidity or a history of poor relationship decisions. I'm curious which one. Rowan laughed despite himself. Can it be both? Fair point. She sipped her own coffee, which she claimed to hate but kept drinking anyway. But seriously, you live alone on the most isolated station in the sector. You work a job that's essentially optimized boredom, and your idea of excitement is reorganizing hydroponic schedules. That's someone hiding from something. I'm not hiding. Everyone's hiding from something. I'm hiding from people who want to kill me. You're hiding from whatever sent you to the edge of mapped space. She tilted her head, studying him. Was it the X? Rowan stared into his coffee, debating how much to share with someone who'd broken into his bed and somehow become the most interesting part of his life in under a week. Her name was Amara. We were engaged. Planned to work together on one of the core colony worlds. Build a life in civilization where things actually happen, and people have ambitions beyond surviving the next supply shipment. What went wrong? I wasn't ambitious enough. She wanted someone who'd climb ranks, make connections, become important. I wanted to do good work and go home at reasonable hours. Turns out those are incompatible life goals. He shrugged, trying to make it casual. She found someone more interesting. I found a job posting for the least interesting station in human space. Everyone got what they wanted. Selivra was quiet for a moment, just watching him. That's why you helped me. You're trying to prove you're not boring. I helped you because you were going to get killed, Rowan corrected. And because apparently I have terrible survival instincts. It's not that deep. Everything's that deep. Humans just pretend otherwise because examining your motivations is uncomfortable. She uncurled from the chair and moved to sit on the far end of the couch, carefully avoiding his feet. For what it's worth, I think your ex was an idiot. Ambition is overrated. I was ambitious once. Look where it got me. Sleeping in a stranger's bed while running from hunters. Exactly, very humbling experience. Would not recommend. Rowan found himself smiling. What were you ambitious about? I was a teacher. On a colony world called Veridian, back before the Covenant decided we were hazards worth eliminating. I taught human children, actually. Literature and history. Tried to bridge the gap between our species, prove we could coexist peacefully. She stared at her coffee like it held answers. The Covenant arrived 3 years ago, classified the entire vampire population as biological threats. We had 2 weeks to evacuate before they started systematic purges. Most of my people didn't make it off-world. The weight of that hung between them, and Rowan felt suddenly ashamed of comparing his romantic failure to actual genocide. I'm sorry. Not your fault. You're just one aggressively pink human on a station full of aggressively pink humans trying to make fungi grow efficiently. You didn't order the purges. Still, that's horrifying. Yes, well, it's been a bad few years. Selivra set down her coffee and looked at him directly. Which is why I need to leave soon. The hunters aren't going away, and the longer I stay, the more danger I put you in. Your ventilation trick bought us time, but they'll eventually expand their search to include residential quarters they've already cleared. When they do, they'll find me. So we make sure they don't find you. Let Rowan be realistic. I am being realistic, he interrupted. Realistically, you walking out there right now is suicide. They're watching every exit. They've locked down cargo transport. Your best chance is to wait them out until they move on to the next station. And if they don't move on, if they decide to do a full biometric scan of every person on Nithros, they have that authority under Covenant emergency protocols. Then we'll figure something out when it happens. But right now, tonight, you're safer here than anywhere else. Selivra studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between frustration and what might have been gratitude. You're very stubborn for someone who claims to avoid confrontation. I'm beginning to realize I'm full of contradictions. Apparently. She stood, stretched with that unsettling grace that reminded him she wasn't human despite appearances, and moved back toward the bedroom. At the doorway she paused. The bed really is large enough for 2 people. I promise I don't bite in my sleep. That's not reassuring coming from a vampire. Fair point. She smiled, and it looked almost mischievous. But I've been sleeping next to you for 4 days while you're unconscious at work. If I wanted to hurt you, I've had ample opportunity. Also not reassuring. I'm trying to tell you that you can stop torturing yourself on that couch. We're both adults. We can share sleeping space without it being weird. It's already weird. You broke into my bed. We've established that the entire situation is fundamentally weird. True, but it could be comfortably weird instead of whatever spine damage you're currently inflicting on yourself. She disappeared into the bedroom before he could respond, leaving him alone with his coffee and his increasingly painful couch. Rowan sat there for a long time, weighing sensibility against the very real possibility that he'd wake up unable to move tomorrow if he spent another night on his current sleeping arrangement. Selivra had a point. They'd been coexisting in his quarters for days now without incident. She'd proven trustworthy, or at least as trustworthy as a fugitive vampire could be, and his back was genuinely starting to develop concerning symptoms. He finished his coffee, washed the cup with more attention than necessary while building up courage, and finally walked to the bedroom doorway. Selivra was already under the covers, facing away from the door, apparently asleep or doing a convincing impression of it. If this gets weird, I'm going back to the couch, Rowan announced to the dark room. Noted, came Selivra's voice, distinctly amused. Now get in bed before you permanently damage something important. Rowan climbed under the covers on the far side of the bed, maintaining what he felt was a very reasonable amount of distance between them. The mattress was significantly more comfortable than the couch, which his spine celebrated immediately. He lay there rigidly, hyper-aware of Selivra's presence, and trying not to think about how this was somehow both the most normal and abnormal thing he'd ever done. Rowan. Yeah, you're doing that thing where you hold your breath. It's loud. I'm not holding my breath. You absolutely are. Just breathe normally. I can hear your heartbeat anyway, so the breathing isn't really the privacy invasion you're worried about. That's deeply unsettling. You get used to it. Now go to sleep. Tomorrow you have to pretend to care about fungal protein yields while I hide in your quarters and judge your holonovel collection further. Despite everything, Rowan felt himself relaxing. There was something absurdly comforting about the routine they'd fallen into, about having someone who knew his terrible secret and hadn't destroyed his life with it. He closed his eyes, listened to Selivra's steady breathing, and realized with some surprise that he felt safer with a vampire in his bed than he'd felt sleeping alone for the past 2 years. Selivra, thank you for not killing me in my sleep. She laughed quietly. You're welcome. Thank you for not reporting me to people who want to kill me while I'm awake. Seemed like the polite thing to do. Very polite. Very boring administrator of you. I'm beginning to think boring might have been inaccurate. I could have told you that days ago, Selivra murmured, already drifting toward sleep. No one boring lets strangers break into their bed and then helps them hide from hunters. You're just bad at recognizing your own capacity for interesting decisions. Rowan wanted to argue, but his exhausted body was already pulling him toward unconsciousness. He fell asleep faster than he had in weeks, and for the first time since Selivra had arrived, he didn't dream about security alarms or covenant hunters or career-ending tribunal hearings. He just slept peacefully, while the red giant turned outside his viewport and the station hummed its endless mechanical lullaby around them. When he woke the next morning, Selivra had shifted closer during the night, one hand resting near his shoulder and her dark hair spilling across both pillows. She was still deeply asleep, completely vulnerable, trusting him with a level of faith that should have terrified him. Instead, Rowan just carefully extracted himself from the bed, got ready for work, and left his quarters feeling like maybe, just maybe, he'd finally done something in his life that mattered more than optimizing agricultural yields. Even if that something was harboring a fugitive, and definitely going to end badly eventually. Rowan came home to find his door already open, which was either a very good sign or the worst possible sign, and given the week he'd had, he was betting on the latter. He stepped through cautiously to find 2 people in tactical gear standing in his living area, weapons holstered but visible, and Selivra backed against the far wall in a defensive crouch that made her look significantly less like the woman who'd been stealing his coffee, and significantly more like something that could kill him before he finished blinking. "Don't move," said the taller of the 2 hunters, a woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd seen every variation of stupid the universe had to offer. Her hand rested on her weapon, casual but ready. "Administrator Cross, I presume." "That's me," Rowan managed, his heart doing complicated acrobatics in his chest. "And you are?" "Covenant Special Operations. I'm Commander Voss. This is Agent Chen. We're here about your unauthorized guest." Rowan's mind raced through a dozen terrible explanations before landing on the only option that might possibly work. "I can explain." "I certainly hope so," Voss said dryly. "Because right now it looks like you've been harboring a classified biological threat for approximately 6 days, which carries a minimum sentence of 5 years in detention facilities that make this station look like a luxury resort." "She's not a threat," Rowan said, positioning himself between the hunters and Selivra without consciously deciding to do so. "She's been here almost a week without incident. No attacks, no violence, nothing. She just needed somewhere safe." "They always need somewhere safe," Chen said, speaking for the first time. He was younger, maybe Rowan's age, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested this job had long since stopped being about righteous protection and started being about following orders. Until they don't. Until they get hungry or desperate or threatened, and then civilians end up dead. "I've had ample opportunity to hurt him," Selivra said, her voice sharp. "I could have killed him the first night. Instead, I asked for sanctuary. He provided it. That deserves consideration, not threats. You broke into his quarters without authorization, overrode his security protocols, and invaded his personal space. That's not asking. That's home invasion. Voss shifted her weight slightly, and Rowan noticed she'd positioned herself for quick action. Though I'll admit, the lack of casualties is unusual. Most of your kind don't show that kind of restraint when cornered. Most of my kind were teachers, artists, engineers, Selivra shot back. We were people trying to live our lives before you decided we were monsters worth exterminating. The only thing that makes me dangerous is that you've spent 3 years hunting us into extinction. Not our call, we enforce covenant policy, we don't make it. How wonderfully convenient for your conscience. Rowan watched the tension escalate and made another catastrophically stupid decision to add to his growing collection. Wait, just wait. Before anyone does anything they'll regret, can we at least talk about this like reasonable adults instead of whatever this is? Voss raised an eyebrow. You want to negotiate with Covenant hunters, that's bold. I want to point out that you've been searching this station for 6 days, and apparently missed someone sleeping in a residential administrator's bed until now, which suggests either your tracking technology isn't as sophisticated as you claim, or she's better at hiding than you're giving her credit for. Either way, maybe that warrants a conversation instead of immediate violence. Chen looked at Voss. Voss looked at Rowan like he'd just suggested they all have a nice cup of tea and discuss their feelings. Then, surprisingly, she laughed. You've got stones, administrator. I'll give you that. She removed her hand from her weapon, which made Rowan's cardiovascular system briefly consider functioning normally again. Fine. You've got 5 minutes to make your case before we do this the official way. Rowan hadn't prepared a speech. He'd barely prepared for work this morning, too preoccupied with the fact that Selivra had been curled against his side when he woke up and neither of them had mentioned it. But now, with 2 armed hunters in his quarters and the woman who'd somehow become important to him backed into a corner, words came. She's been here 6 days. In that time I've gone to work, come home, lived my normal life. We've shared meals. Well, I've had meals and she's judged my food choices, but the point stands. We've coexisted peacefully in close quarters without any incidents. She's proven that vampires can live alongside humans without being threats. Isn't that worth more than just eliminating her, because policy says so? Policy exists for a reason, Chen said, but he sounded less convinced than before. Policy exists because someone decided an entire species was too dangerous to tolerate. But Selivra taught human children before the purges. She's lived among humans her entire life. The only thing that makes her dangerous is being hunted. Rowan took a breath, feeling Selivra's eyes on him. You want to eliminate threats. Fine. But maybe consider that you're creating more threats than you're preventing by treating an entire people like vermin. Voss was quiet for a long moment, studying both of them with professional assessment. You realize that by defending her, you're implicating yourself in harboring charges. Your career is over. Best case scenario, you're looking at criminal proceedings and reassignment to somewhere significantly worse than Nithros. Worst case, you're sharing a cell with her. I know, Rowan said, and realized he actually meant it. But I'd rather face consequences for doing something right than avoid them by doing something wrong. Something right, Voss repeated, then turned to Selivra. What about you? You've been quiet. Any brilliant arguments for why we should ignore 6 years of covenant policy? Selivra straightened slowly, dropping the defensive posture. No brilliant arguments, just the truth. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of living like every moment might be my last because people like you decided my existence is inherently criminal. She glanced at Rowan, and something soft crossed her expression. But I met someone who saw past the propaganda, who offered sanctuary without expecting anything in return, who's apparently willing to sacrifice his career to defend me despite knowing me for less than a week. That gives me hope that maybe not all humans have forgotten how to see other people as people. The silence that followed felt heavy with decisions being made. Chen shifted uncomfortably. Voss pulled out a datapad and began typing something with quick, efficient movements. Rowan held his breath and tried not to think about detention facilities. "Here's what's going to happen," Voss finally said, not looking up from her datapad. "Officially, we tracked the vampire to this station, conducted a thorough search, and found no evidence of her presence. She escaped our net and is assumed to have stowed away on an outbound transport. Our report will reflect that. Case closed." Rowan blinked. "What?" "Unofficially, I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've eliminated 43 vampires in that time, and I stopped counting how many of them begged for mercy after the first year, because it was making me question things I couldn't afford to question." She looked up at Selivra. "But I've never had one spend 6 days in close proximity to a human and not hurt them. Never had one prioritize someone else's safety over their own. That's either remarkable restraint or evidence that maybe the threat assessment is flawed." "You're letting her go?" Rowan couldn't quite process what he was hearing. "I'm closing a case due to lack of evidence. What happens after that isn't my concern." Voss pocketed her datapad. "Though I'd suggest your guest finds somewhere less predictable to hide. We won't be the last hunters the Covenant sends, and the next ones might be less interested in nuance." Chen cleared his throat. "Commander, this violates direct protocols. Are you questioning my tactical assessment, Agent?" "No, ma'am." "Good, then our work here is done." Voss moved toward the door, then paused to look back at Rowan. "For the record, Administrator Cross, you're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, possibly both. But that speech about creating threats versus preventing them, that's going in my report. Maybe someone up the chain will actually read it and think. Probably not, but maybe." She left. Chen followed, though not before giving Rowan a look that might have been respect or pity or both. The door closed behind them with a soft hiss, leaving Rowan and Selivra alone in the sudden, ringing silence. "That," Selivra said carefully, "was unexpected." Rowan's legs decided they were done supporting his weight, and he sat down hard on his terrible couch. "I thought we were dead. I was completely certain we were dead." "We almost were." Selivra moved away from the wall, some of the tension bleeding from her posture. "But you defended me. You knew what it would cost, and you did it anyway." "Of course I did. Rowan stopped, realizing he didn't quite have words for what Selivra had become in 6 days. "You're not just some fugitive I'm harboring. You're someone who trusted me when you had no reason to. Someone who's been making terrible coffee jokes and judging my holonovels and somehow made my boring life interesting. I wasn't going to just let them take you." Selivra sat beside him on the couch, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You're aware that I still need to leave, right?" Voss was correct. "Other hunters will come. I can't stay here indefinitely." "I know." Rowan did know, had known from the beginning that this was temporary, but the reality of it still felt like something heavy settling in his chest. "Where will you go?" "There are communities. Vampires who have found ways to survive on the fringes. I have contacts, safe routes, I'll figure it out." She turned to look at him. "I always do." "Right, of course." Rowan tried to sound supportive and definitely failed. "Well, it's been memorable. The breaking and entering, the life-threatening danger, the career-destroying decisions. Real highlight, real material." "Rowan." "I'm fine, it's fine. You should probably leave soon while Voss's official report is still fresh. Don't want to waste the opportunity." "Rowan, look at me." He did, and found Selivra watching him with an expression he'd never seen before, something vulnerable and uncertain and maybe a little sad. "What?" "Thank you for everything. For not screaming when you found me. For warning me about the inspections. For defending me to hunters who could have killed us both. For being someone who proved that humans and vampires can share space without it ending in tragedy." She reached out and took his hand, her skin cool against his. "You changed something for me, made me believe that maybe there's still hope for coexistence. That's not nothing." "It's not enough," Rowan said quietly. "You're still leaving. Still running, still living in fear. For now, but maybe someday that changes. Maybe someday someone reads Voss's report and actually thinks about what it means. Maybe someday I can stop running." She smiled, and it was genuine. Because someone on a boring station decided I was worth defending. They sat there for a while, hands clasped, neither quite ready to acknowledge that this was goodbye. Outside the viewport, Nithro's station continued its endless orbit around the dying red giant, and somewhere in the network of corridors and chambers, life went on exactly as it always had. Except for Rowan Cross, colony administrator, who'd woken up 6 days ago to find a vampire in his bed, and somehow become someone capable of standing up to armed hunters for a person he barely knew. Selivra left 3 hours later, after they'd finished his remaining coffee rations, and she'd made one last disparaging comment about his holonovel collection. She slipped out during the night cycle, moving through shadows with practiced ease, and Rowan watched her go from his viewport until she disappeared into the station's mechanical depths. He went to bed alone that night, the mattress feeling too large and the quarters too quiet. Sleep came eventually, though it took longer than it had when he wasn't alone. 3 weeks later, Rowan was reviewing protein synthesis reports with the same dedication he'd always brought to meaningless administrative tasks when his door chimed. He opened it expecting Petra with more complaints about bacterial cultures, and instead found Selivra standing in his corridor wearing new clothes and an expression that might have been nervousness. "Hi," she said. "You came back," Rowan said stupidly, because his brain had apparently forgotten how to form complex sentences. "The Covenant decided I was more useful as a liaison than a target. Something about demonstrating successful human-vampire cohabitation. Apparently, some commander filed a report that actually got read." She shrugged. "They're assigning me to work with colony stations on integration protocols. First posting is here. Nithros needs a cultural consultant, apparently. Here, you're staying here. If that's acceptable, I understand if you'd prefer I found other quarters. We did technically only agree to temporary arrangements, and you've probably appreciated having your bed back." Rowan pulled her inside and closed the door before anyone could see the ridiculous smile spreading across his face. "The bed's available if you want it, properly this time, with actual permission and everything." Selivra smiled back, and it transformed her entire face. "I was hoping you'd say that. Though fair warning, I'm still going to judge your holonovel collection. I'd be disappointed if you didn't." They stood there in his small quarters, looking at each other like people who'd found something unexpected and were still figuring out what to do with it. Outside, the red giant continued dying in spectacular slow motion. Inside, 2 people from different species who'd met under impossible circumstances began figuring out how to live together without desperation forcing the arrangement. It wouldn't be easy. There would be complications, bureaucracy, prejudice from both sides. But Rowan had learned something important over the past 3 weeks of sleeping alone. Boring was overrated, safety was an illusion, and sometimes the most interesting parts of life came from letting dangerous strangers into your bed and choosing to defend them anyway. "Welcome home," he said, and meant it. Selivra's smile widened. "Thank you. Now let's discuss your terrible coffee situation. We need to fix that immediately." "My coffee is fine." "Your coffee is a crime against beverages. But don't worry, I have 3 weeks of opinions saved up about how to improve it." Rowan laughed, and it felt like the first honest sound he'd made in years. "Of course you do." They moved deeper into the quarters together, already falling into comfortable argument, and somewhere in the distance, Nithro's station hummed its endless mechanical song, indifferent to the small miracle happening in Unit 347, where a boring administrator and a fugitive vampire were learning that home wasn't always about safety or predictability. Sometimes it was just about finding someone worth defending and having them choose to come back.